It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, dig into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Jason Hewlett, and we're going to be discussing his new book, Dying Light, an investigation into near-death experiences. Jason, it is truly an honor, sir. Welcome to the show.
Well, thanks so much for having me on, Shaun. I think this is the first time I've been called like a leading thought thinker or something like that. That was pretty cool.
Well, by the end of this episode, we will escalate your fame, all the things, to heights you've never achieved or experienced before. So welcome to the elite club of soon to be former guests, so to speak, on the Shaun Tabatt Show. I think the place I'd like to start out, this is the first time my audience is meeting you, first time you and I have connected. I would love to hear a bit of the Jason Hewlett origin story, superpowers, special abilities, all the things. Share that with us now.
I guess like in an elevator pitch format, I'm a paranormal investigator and researcher, also an author and filmmaker. My background is actually in journalism. I was a crime reporter for 10 years at a daily newspaper, but I've always had an interest in the paranormal since I was like a little kid. So somehow my passion for journalism and the paranormal married itself with a film degree that I got from the 90s. And so this is how I spend my time, telling paranormal stories, plus investigating allegedly haunted locations.
And I think a lot of us have a perception of what it means to be a paranormal investigator from all the various TV shows, YouTube shows. I mean, there's a ton of content in this space these days, but give us an example. Like, how do you get something to investigate, and like just give us a sense of what that looks like if somebody has no clue what you're talking about.
So yeah, basically what happens is, because I'm the co-founder of the Canadian Paranormal Society, so actually people find us for the most part. I'd say like 75-80% of the time. They own a business, they've got a home, they have stuff going on that they don't understand, and that generally frightens them. And so they ask us to come in and investigate. And we have sort of our methodology upon which we go about an investigation and try to determine what is happening. Now, a lot of the time, what we find is a very natural explanation that's generally being unintentionally blown out of proportion just because of all, like you say, there's all this paranormal content out there and it puts ideas in people's heads about what's going on. But when we can rule out all logical explanations, then we're left with just, it's like the Occam's razor principle, that there's something going on there at the location that can't be explained. And we will not go and tell you that you've got a ghost or something, because we don't know what it is. That's the thing. The bottom line is we don't know what's going on, but that there's something going on that's being classified as paranormal only because science hasn't figured it out yet. And quite often it is believed that it is generally interacting with the spirit of a deceased person or something else, right? Because there's a whole realm of possibilities for what this could be out there, depending on your belief, your life experience. And we're just finding that there's lots of potential explanations for this. So if we're lucky, we get invited back to investigate again, because we apply a scientific method, or as scientific a method as we can. So we like to test theories and methodologies repeatedly if we can. Quite often, though, people are quite happy that we've confirmed that something's going on. They're not nuts or hallucinating. And they're generally quite happy just to kind of live with whatever that reality is. So that's basically how it works. None of us have any formal training. There is no formal training. There's no such thing as experts in this field, despite what TV tells you. We're all people passionate on the subject matter who like to help people and kind of get answers to our own questions, because pretty much every paranormal investigator has had an experience that he or she had as a child growing up that sort of influenced this thing.
And when we started talking before we got into the interview, it sounds like you and I watched some of the same shows growing up that kind of clued us into mysteries and the unexplained, and even my work in the NDE space that fits kind of in just the supernatural, mysterious, where we're trying to all make sense of it. In terms of like tools of the trade, I only asked it because I joined your guys' Facebook group last night, and I think one of the posts I saw was like for discounted gear for paranormal investigation. I was like, well, I wasn't expecting to see that pop up. In terms of like tools of the trade, what, if you go out to do an investigation, what are some of the things you bring with you for the investigation?
We keep it pretty. It's funny because that discount paranormal to equipment, that Peter ran, my colleague and close friend. We actually, as a group, we build our own equipment, because you can go out and buy equipment from places like Ghost Stop and all these other places, but you have no idea what's in it. And a lot of the time people have put computer chips in it that generate words. Like we don't use apps, we don't use anything. We build our own equipment, but we do keep it very simple. We use digital recorders is our primary tool to record sound. Pen and paper to write down when things happen. Because I have a film background, I use like video cameras with night vision on it, the GoPros, just to document what's going on. Because we do a web series out of it sometimes. We use a device called a spirit box. That's something I think is quite known and it's quite controversial, and it picks up AM, FM frequencies and channels through them. Because one of the prevailing theories is we are made of energy, right? And when we die, that energy goes somewhere. I'm not talking soul, I'm just talking about the energy inside our body. And so it goes in, there's a belief that it goes into the Earth's electromagnetic field, and that what might be happening is basically like recordings playing back more than anything else at these locations where people have died or trauma has occurred. So the theory is that by kind of tapping into the radio waves, you're picking up on that energy and they're able to speak to you using this device. But it has its own pitfalls as well. So really our primary equipment is like, thermal, basically digital recorders, pen and paper, cameras. We'll use thermal imagery because, the picking up cold spots, thing like that. That's really about it. Like there's a whole bunch of other stuff that people will try to sell you. Like, like these devices that light up and all that. We create like these tripwires that are motion activated that'll light up and make a sound if something, because then if we're in one part of the house, we know they're all the only people there, and one of these goes off in another room, then potentially something has touched it or moved it that could be a spirit or ghost or whatever you want to call it, right? But we keep it very simple. There's a lot of other stuff out there like these, Kinect cameras that try to make human figures out of things moving around, but that's using technology created for video games, and it's supposed to create patterns anyways, right? So you can't really trust that that's showing you a spirit as far as we're concerned.
And you had mentioned that you use some of the footage from these investigations for your series. Talk to us a little bit about the We Want to Believe series, and maybe how does it differ from some of the? Would you say it's less hypey than some of the stuff we see on TV these days?
That's the point of it, is we're kind of the anti-popular paranormal reality, quote unquote, reality show. Because a lot of those shows are, it's on network television, right? They need to make advertising dollars off of it and pay their budget and things like that. So, and there's stories that do circulate about these shows going in, I think with the best of intentions at the first, but then becoming, you've got to get ratings. You got to keep your ratings up. You got to show ghosts. And that's what people want to see that watch this kind of stuff, right? We want to be scared and see frightening things. But what we do is our show is in certain situations where we are allowed to film and interview the people and they're not worried about it getting out publicly. We try to show what goes on in a real paranormal investigation. So if we do an investigation and we record it and nothing happens, that's what happens at the end of the show. And we try to explain why nothing would happen. And when something does happen, we try to explain it. First, we try to explain it away as maybe something that's possible, like I said earlier. If not, we're left with, maybe the possible question that we've experienced something. And so we've had episodes, they've run on YouTube and then moved to Paraflix, which is a streaming app. We're now switching over to another platform here shortly. And we've covered off places like Barkerville, which is an old ghost town here in British Columbia, Canada. We've done a few residential cases, a place called Bailey House, which has got a long history. So we try to cover a variety of things. And when it's a historical site, we try to tell the story of the location, because quite often, if there's a story of hauntings, it's tied into the history of the place. We like to show that as well. So that's kind of our little bit of entertainment that we put out there, but we're trying to show what really goes on in this very unsexy and unexciting world of paranormal investigations.
Well, I love that you're willing to share it, even if the conclusion is underwhelming. Because again, I feel like a lot of the broader content, especially on network TV, no matter what, it's probably going to come to some crazy conclusion. And, where I feel like sometimes it can really be stretching the truth or reaching. So I love that if the conclusion is just kind of, well, it is what it is. So I'd rather see people be honest than lead people down other strange roads. Before we get to Dying Light, I want to give you a chance too to speak about, you got a new book and documentary coming out fairly soon. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to partner up with, be recruited by, however you want to word it, with a company called Small Town Monsters, run by Seth Breedlove. And they're documentary filmmakers out of Canton, Ohio. And literally that's what they do, Small Town Monsters. They go to these places where there are these stories of like Bigfoot or Dogman or Mothman, and they tell the story related to that, very similar to what we do, but in the monster realm. And last year in May, they came up to British Columbia, to Harrison Hot Springs to do a documentary, because that's where the birth of Sasquatch really happened. John Green was an investigator and researcher, and that's where the term Sasquatch came from. So while they were doing that, one of the crew, Eli Watson, who's a friend of mine, wanted to do something on Ogopogo because he was up here and fascinated with the story. So he invited me to join him. So, and at the time, I'd already started researching and writing a book on Ogopogo. So it was kind of this synchronicity. So in the end, I've got the documentary Cursed Waters, Creature of Lake Okanagan coming out. And they also basically picked up my book on Ogopogo as well. And it's called, oh gosh, what is it? The Legend of Ogopogo, Canada's Loch Ness Monster. The title's changed a few times, kind of thing. But they're both, the movie's premiering at Monster Fest at the end of June in Canton, Ohio. And the book will be coming out about the same time. So I'm pretty excited about that.
And for people who want to keep an eye on that, find out, where should they go for that?
Smalltownmonsters.com, and you can also follow them on Facebook and Instagram, TikTok, all over the place. So,
and like we do with every episode, we'll make it easy. If you want to check that out, we'll have links in the description and the show notes. If it's something that strikes your fancy, you can just click on through and see what there is to see. We're finally going to get into the book now that we came here to talk about today. Let's get a little bit into story behind the book. I mean, I can say from my experience, while I found NDEs intriguing, I never intended to spend years and years of my life researching and writing a bunch of books, but here I find myself. I'm curious, how did you fall into the NDE space? Like you said, you were very much interested in paranormal stuff from a young age. And you could certainly say near to the experiences are an offshoot of that space, but to get to the place where research, write a book, that's a commitment. Like, how did the book get started for you?
It's funny. It started kind of by accident, because this book and our first two books were published by Beyond the Fray Publishing. And when Peter and I were putting together our second book, which was basically, it's subtitled An Investigator's Archive, literally that's what we did. We interviewed 22 different people in the paranormal space, from like filmmakers to cryptozoologists to fellow paranormal investigators. And one of them, Angela Artuso, who is a friend of Peter's, when she was sort of telling her story, she had a near-death experience. But it was so powerful to hear and so dramatic, to fit that in to just her general chapter just wouldn't do it justice. So as soon as so we're doing it over Zoom because we're writing it at kind of the height of the pandemic, we clicked off and I phoned Peter right away. And I'm like, Peter, like, this is a book. Like, we could do a book. And Peter had his own near-death experience, which is chronicled in the book as well. So basically, that day we pitched it to Beyond the Fray Publishing. Would you guys be interested in a book about near-death experiences? And they jumped at the idea of that. And so it basically went from there. That's exactly literally how it happened. So we wrapped up, the Investigator's Archive, and it came out October of 2021. And literally like the next day we started researching and lining up interviews for Dying Light, which came out June of 2022, I believe it actually came out. Just hit audiobook though in the last little while. So that's really how the book happened. It was kind of by wonderful accident.
And I've listened through the audiobook twice already. And I know some of my audiobook aficionados get nervous when it says virtual voice. And again, I'm super picky about audiobooks as a 10 plus year podcasting veteran who's edited all my own content. I'm super picky about audio. As a publishing guy, I'm like, what? Let's use a real narrator. But the virtual voice experience was fantastic. Like, other than like 4 or 5 words that weren't pronounced right, like it was flawless, and it sounded like a normal dude reading the book. So don't let virtual voice turn you off. It was a good listening experience.
Oh, I'm happy to hear that because I haven't heard it yet. So that's excellent.
And in terms of like reading, research, interviews, like to prep for this book, like what was the balance of interviews versus reading other content?
I'd say it was pretty much 50-50. Like when I'd interview, in order to find the people I wanted to interview, I needed to do the research, right? And sort of while doing that research, I came across people that I was like, okay, I'd like to talk to them, etc. I was lucky enough to kind of know a publicist who had guests in her list that were in the NDE realm. I knew I wanted to talk to some scientists, right? Because I like to balance. I have a journalism background, so I don't just want to sell one story. I want to kind of balance it out. So I had to look up. That's where Lawrence Ward, he was the psychologist through University of British Columbia, came from, and Andrea Sodu, I believe is his last name. And he did sort of he used like numbers to kind of track near-death experiences and kind of quantify them that way. And then Jolene Lindsay, who's a grief and trauma counselor, I really wanted to get that perspective too. Like, why would we believe in near-death experiences? And one thing I found in the world of the paranormal is generally people who believe in the paranormal and ghosts have had something traumatic happen either directly to them or to someone they know. So I wanted to kind of touch on that. Like, why is there sort of this need or want to believe in even a life after death? Right. And so it really, yeah, 50-50. And I mean, it took a long time, like to kind of so once you kind of do all this research, then you got to line up your interviews and interview the people. And I was really happy with how it came together. But next to the Ogo Pogo book, it was the book that took the longest to kind of research and interview and then write.
Yeah, in my experience, the one thing people want is a good mix of stories for these books, and capturing stories that get across what you really want to communicate in the book. Sometimes it can be hard. You don't always hit a home run the very first time, depending on the guests that you're pulling on. In terms of your history with being a paranormal investigator, like, did you pull on any of those? Obviously, you read and you research, but maybe the better way to ask it, like, going after this kind of a project, was that a little bit different than some of the other paranormal research you've done? Because NDEs is kind of a different sort of niche space.
Yeah, it was totally different. It was a book while writing it. I can't say this for Peter, but I know it changed my perception on things because I had a pretty set idea, kind of what I thought about near-death experiences and you know what happens when we die. But it really kind of, I guess it opened my mind to sort of broader possibilities. And I kind of mentioned, like, it's not something that we can go and investigate per se. Like, our investigation was the research and the interviewing. That's really all you can do. I didn't really feel like being, having induced death and seeing if I could make it back. And I just wasn't willing to risk that right now. You know what I mean? So it changed things. But talking to these people, like there's some interviews in the book that I thought, wow, that is really out there. Like, you know what I mean? I think Scott Taylor was one of those where he talked about where he had it basically, he didn't die, but someone he loved, two people he loved died, and they took him with him to the other side. That to me, I was having a hard time buying that, but he told that story with such emotion and conviction that it was hard not to believe him. And I hate saying that because it's not that I doubted him, but it's just pushing the realm of what I can accept just based on my own life experiences. But when Peter Panagore was started talking about when he went to the other side and he decided he needed to come back, and that bit with, he was talking about the tunnel and all these different options where he could have gone. I had an experience like that, not dying, but just weird experience that I kind of chronicle at the beginning of the book where something very similar to that happened to me. So where it's big, is this life that we live the only life we're living? And when we die, do we get to go and try out another one? You know what I mean? Like that really, I've started believing more into like this whole multiverse concept after researching and writing this book than I was open to it, say, before. So yeah, it was a different experience, very moving, a very powerful one. And I think much like many of the people who had these near-death experiences, the subject of death and the prospect of my own death isn't frightening anymore, or as frightening as it would have been prior to writing that book.
Yeah, I mean, that is a common thing you hear from a good majority of the near-death experiencers is they are no longer afraid of dying. They feel like they have an assurance and a comfort level with where they're going to go again after they die. I have found a handful of people like Howard Storm is a real classic near-death experience story. People are very familiar. Like, he was on Oprah back in the day. His book is well known. He's probably one of the few people I've met he just still, even all these years later, sharing his story, still seemed like he was PTSD, somewhat traumatized from the darker parts of his experience. But by and large, I guess maybe I've encountered more people who've had positive near-death experiences as opposed to disturbing or DNDEs, disturbing or distressing near-death experiences, as folks call them. And the whole shared death experience phenomenon, Raymond Moody, in his most recent book, who's kind of the granddaddy of the NDE space, he coined the phrase near-death experiences. He feels like the shared death experience is the new frontier in research. Obviously, if you're having a shared death experience with somebody who's dying or has crossed over, you probably need them to still come back to verify it. But he looks at it from the perspective of, like, this is, if you have two people, the one person who's the shared experiencer and the actual near-death experiencer, like there could be an interesting dialogue there where one could kind of validate the other. So, he feels like that's the new frontier in terms of upcoming research. In terms of your experience too, what was interesting to me, one of the things I talked about in my most recent book is just the idea of, and I didn't coin this. I think I got it from an interview with Pim Van Lummel, who's got a very popular NDE book. But the idea of a spiritually transformative experience where you're not sick, you're not dying, you're not any of these things, yet you enter into some kind of an encounter or an experience that has like the same life altering effects, or some of these have like the same like milestone high points of an actual all the steps of a traditional NDE, but you're not dying and you're not sick. If you wouldn't mind, I'd love to just have you take us into that experience because I thought it was pretty unique. You share that early on in the book.
Yeah, it was like 2018, right before my son's birthday, like literally the night before. And I had just been sort of watching a movie and hanging out downstairs. It was November. I went outside just to kind of like, it was warm. I had a fire going, so I just went outside. Sometimes I like to do that and just step outside before going to bed kind of thing. And it was cold outside. And I remember coming in, kind of getting ready, like, brushing my teeth and all that, getting into pajamas. And I got into bed and I was like still kind of cold. And then instead of falling asleep, I started having this weird panic attack where it felt like I was dying. And I've had this happen a couple times in my life, but there's nothing going on. I've been checked out. There's no problems. And basically that's what happened. Like, it's kind of like, all right, well, here you are. This voice starts talking to me. It's like, you live in this life, but you have an opportunity right now. If you want to go to a life where your father didn't die, because he died when I was 19 and he was 56, you can do that. If you want to go to a life where you can be with this person instead of your wife, you can do that. But you've got to make a choice and you've got to make it now. And it's going to be different. And that to me was terrifying because it's like, I'm quite happy in the life I have right now with my wife and my son, and the work I do. It was just, and basically, if it wasn't for my wife, I felt like I might have slipped away. Like, she was there and I'm kind of like starting to cry and everything like that. And she's like holding me like, what's wrong? Because I woke her up. And she said I was ice cold. Like my body, like I'd been outside for hours. I was ice cold. And I'm basically telling her like, no, this is like, I love you and all this stuff and don't go and all this. And that's what happened. And I mean, it was just the weirdest thing, but I have no idea where it came from, but I heard a voice talking to me saying, this is what can happen right now if you make this choice. Cause I've always, you do that at certain points in your life. You wonder, well, what if I'd chosen this path instead? Or what if this had happened? All these, and it's almost like someone decided to come and answer that question, say, okay, well, nut up. Like if you want to try something different, here's your chance. Otherwise, shut up and here's the life you've got, basically. And so whatever that was, I'm thankful for that experience. And it changed. It was funny. Like, I was affected. I talked about it with people and it took weeks for me to get over that, to kind of feel like I kind of come back to like, some sort of normal level, but I never forgot it. And so when Peter mentioned that experience while I was interviewing him, I was like, holy crap. Like, that's something big happened there. I think that's tied into this other phenomena going on.
Well, and that's the thing you discover more and more. Whether you have an experience like you just described, or you just start interviewing a ton of people who've had these encounters or these experiences, is it breaks all your paradigms. Like, you're okay, yeah, because in my space, people tend to have very wooden rules in theology about if you do X, you deserve to go to hell. If you do Y, you'll get to go to heaven. And I've talked with people where they're having this what would be definitely classified as a disturbing or distressing near-death experience, and they're being taken down into what seems like sort of their final resting place in hell, and they'll cry out to Jesus, or an angel will show up, or even sometimes God shows up and says, I made a promise to your mother who's been praying for you for 35 years, and the person will say they were pulled out of hell and then we're allowed to go back to their life, which again, depending on your paradigms, your worldview, a lot of this flies in the face of some of what we were taught growing up and that sort of a thing. And so the more people I meet, the more time I spend in this space. I'm not saying you have to be theologically squishy, but it really causes you to wrestle with, well, what do I believe? What's actually possible? People talk about time slowing down in the midst of an accident and different things happening where it seems like as they cross over or while they're on the other side, people are given choices and a lot of opportunities to make decisions. And, again, with some of our very wooden kind of black and white ideas, it's it can be hard to process. And so, like for me, I'm kind of glad I stumbled in this space later in life, just as I'm older and have more maturity and life experience. Like I feel like I can process some of this a lot easier than when I was young and dumb back in my 20s and 30s. I would have been probably like put out by someone. Like, this is just not, it's not okay. Like it's like this or it's like that. And so, if you're gonna spend time in this space, you'll learn to be flexible, because the stuff people share, it's going to fly in the face of what you think you knew, and it'll just shift and break all of your paradigms. In terms of a section of the book, like I felt like this was a big section of the book. You got to spend time working with Lynn K. Russell, who worked with Dr. Jeffrey Long, who, if you've listened to this podcast for any length of time, you've heard me reference Dr. Long many, many times. I mean, like, I feel like he has one of the best, most exhaustive bodies of research. I think at this point, there are well over 3,000 near-death experiences that they've studied. And the one thing I say all the time is I think my favorite part of his research is, on average, it takes somebody 7 years to process what they experience. And this has been fascinating. Just, I've interviewed people that they were like 6 months from their experience, a year and a half, and then other people who are 10, 15, 20, 30 years out. And it is interesting how over the long haul, people actually experience, or they have more understanding as time goes on. Like a lot of people very much remember details of their experience, but how they process it, how they make peace with it and understand it, it expands through the years, which is just weird. I always say it's like the human brain can't process the download it got on the other side, and it just takes a long time for the mind to catch up. But any of Jeff's books are fantastic. Would highly recommend them. Talk to us just a little bit about working with Lynn, and like just I feel like she really helped establish some baselines for you with the book.
Well, she was fortunately the first person I actually interviewed, which was great because she did kind of basically talking to her set. And that's why I kind of used her at the beginning. You know what I mean? It set the groundwork for everything. Because again, I went into this knowing very little other than what you might hear in pop culture references and stuff like that. And then hearing Angela's story. So yeah, she set the benchmark, and just because she had that breadth of knowledge that she was willing to share. And just like when she would tell stories about, people coming back more than 24 hours after they've been technically dead, like they're down in the morgue and they're done and they just kind of wake up. I've never heard of that before, but that changes again your view on what death is and what can happen. And it was a great experience. I only got to spend maybe like an hour or so with her, but it was very valuable time. Just she opened my brain up to this whole world. Gave me the knowledge I needed, I think, to conduct good interviews going forward for Peter and I. Yeah, it was just fascinating. And she gave me a whole bunch of research material too, which I read through and everything, which I really was thankful for as well. She's like in Alberta, which is the next province over. I didn't even know that she was in Canada. I thought that was fantastic too, that there's this prominent Canadian researcher who had worked with someone in the field who was so well known. She was a great catch, for lack of a better wording. It was an insightful interview.
Well, and there's such a variety in terms of, some people will have experiences and they're only gone for a few minutes. They get resuscitated. I mean, that is one of the things that's dramatically shifted since Dr. Moody started documenting things back in the day, is medical technology has improved. And people are, they'll have these expansive experiences, but maybe they're only gone for 2 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever it may be. And then you have the other extreme of the person who's lying on a slab in the morgue and they've been gone for 15 hours or 20 hours. Like, I feel like there's more in terms of consciousness. I feel like there's more to wrestle with the person who, was only clinically dead for a very short time versus the person who, there's no way anything was functioning at all. I think one of my favorite stories I've encountered through the years, Ian McCormick is a gentleman who was night diving and gets stung by 5 box jellyfish, and one should kill you, let alone 5. And there's this whole comedy of errors of, he eventually makes it to the hospital, but his body's so screwed up by the time he gets there, there's not a whole lot they can do. And, he freaks out a guy putting a toe tag on him in the morgue, like some 10 plus hours later. And he dramatically walks out the next day. Like, he experienced crazy, miraculous healing. But again, there's no logical reasoning as to why Ian should even be alive, getting stung by 5 jellyfish. I mean, that's probably one of the most extreme stories I've heard through the years.
Well, it comes down, I mean, because yeah, you say when it only lasts like, there are people that it's like 30 seconds to a minute. Well, I mean, but it feels like forever. Like dreams are like that. Like most dreams are supposed to be really short, but they feel like your brain just makes it feel like it's this long process. So are those people that had the short term? That's where I can see why skeptics come in, right? Well, they were only dead for like only dead for 30 seconds or a minute, but that's long enough, obviously, for someone to go on. But your consciousness, your brain hasn't stopped functioning yet. So what is that? Is that like what Lawrence Ward said? Is it just, your mind just trying to make sense of what's happening to you? And somehow you've heard enough stories about near-death experiences that this is what it's sort of, because we like to do that. We like to try, our minds like to sort things out into some sort of order. Well, it's like, okay, well, something traumatic happened. I feel like I'm fading out, so I'm having this near-death experience. And then you come back and you're fine because they've been able to like crash cart you and bring you back. But when it's been, like you say, 15 hours, your brain's dead. Rigor mortis is set in. Like there's something much more profound going on. And there are these documented cases where that's happened. So there's one, I think it was on that Netflix series, Surviving Death. It was the woman who was a diver. Can't remember her name right now, but she was underwater for like a really long time. What is it like? It might even been like almost half an hour trapped underwater, and her air had run out and everything, but she came back. And you can't ignore that. And you can't just write that off as like your consciousness. You know what I mean? There's something much more profound going on.
And I feel like that is probably one of the more challenging spaces, depending on whether you're trying to approach this from some kind of a faith-based worldview or more of a secular context. I feel like especially in my publishing space, we're probably not as worried about what do we do with this consciousness? When does it transition? What happens? Because we're processing it from a Christian worldview lens. Well, that's the spirit leaving the body, and so we're kind of putting our take on it versus more and more books I read on the more secular leaning side. So much of the research is focused on consciousness, trying to understand it, trying to figure out when and how does it transition, what does it mean when when it comes back, and all the different things. And so I think depending on the lens you're trying to use to just live with this, understand it, figure it out, I feel like that dramatically impacts kind of where people go with research or maybe the questions that they're really trying to answer.
For sure, there's a bias, right? I think they come into
Right.
it with a bias, and I think we tried really hard to come in at Dying Light without one. We're investigators, so we're just investigating it and seeing what we can find. Which I the last line of the book, I think, is so. The question now is, what do you believe? Because what do you believe? I'm not going to give you an answer as to what this was because I can't answer that. But I think there's a risk, like sort of on both sides, the secular, and the faith based, because there's that lens that they're looking at it, and I think the truth is kind of more in the middle. Personally, and that's just where I come at it from someone who is like, raised Christian, but doesn't really practice, but is a very spiritual person, more based on his life experience, but wants to apply some scientific method to thing. I think the answer is in the middle, but no side wants to look at the middle. You know what I mean?
Right. Well, and even like I know in my context, like some of the folks who watch and listen to the show, they get uncomfortable when I talk to people from the other side of the fence or who are coming at things from maybe a slightly different worldview lens. But what I find and what I love to talking to people like yourself and others is I find when people approach these things from their bent, their worldview, you with your paranormal investigation background, you will pull on strings and see facets and intricacies of things in a way that I never would have conceived of. Because, like all of us, we come at it with a bias, or if we're working on book projects, we're looking for things to support our ideas and the story that we want to tell. And so I find these sorts of interviews very sharpening because you're coming at things from such a different way where I find my understanding of the space gets expanded just a little bit with every one of these conversations, reading books in this space as well. And so, um, I would almost rather talk to people who are approaching this from a slightly different angle than me all day long because it helps me to communicate better. And sometimes, in sharing these sorts of stories, like I want to communicate them in a way where it's as accessible to everybody. And so, just by spending time who are maybe they're passionate about it and want to talk about these sorts of things. I love spending time with people who aren't just stuck in my bubble. So
I wish there was more people like you, Shaun. This world would be a better place if people were willing to. I think when people have a belief system, I even deal with this in my world, right? People have a belief system and they come up against something that kind of pushes against that. I think it's scary because they don't want to be we all like to have things make sense. And so I think, people get kind of worried or scary, or that's where they let their skepticism come in. They don't want to have anything challenged. But I think the world's a better place when we sort of challenge it, even if we challenge our own belief systems or have things happen. Like I've had something happen to me. I went and talked about it with a buddy of mine who's Catholic. I'm like, I had this experience, and he's like, "We heard the voice of God," and I'm like, "Really? Like, why?" But when he explained it to me, I was like, "Well, that does make sense, and what maybe I did." Like, so I can't discount that. I think it's good because I think we're better people when we're more open to different ideas and thought processes. I think it makes us just a better species. But for some reason, especially in these times right now, people don't want that. They just want to stay in their nice little world and not have it challenged.
Yeah, and I would say if you're going to rub shoulders with kind of all sides of this particular conversation, is you just need to be confident in what you believe. Like I don't, I can disagree with somebody, but it doesn't mean I'm offended. Again, I try to use it as a learning experience, and like I said earlier, maybe the great thing I get out of it is next time I tell one of these stories, I communicate it in a way that's far better, and somebody from a different camp can receive it better, or maybe they'll better understand how I perceive. But again, I see it as a sharpening experience, and I really enjoy it. So don't be afraid to read books and talk to people who are outside of your space, so to speak. But I would say if you're going to spend time in the space doing interviews and whatnot, you do need to be confident in what you yourself believe, because as I found, the more I went down the NDE rabbit hole, the more I discovered, oh my gosh, there's UFOs, there's ancient tribe, like there's all kinds of interest. Like when you get into the broader stuff, like it's all over the place. And so you're just gonna have to be comfortable with that not everybody is just processing this through a straightforward faith lens. Like it's all over the place. One of the areas just in this space, or I always say that one of the ditches, and you talk about this some in the book, is people who remember past lives. Like when you get into stuff like that, this is where I feel like your worldview really comes into play. Because for folks who aren't processing this through a Christian lens, would be like, well, that's just reincarnation, and if I were to process the whole past lives phenomenon, I might say, yeah, I really feel like that person's being influenced by some kind of maybe a demonic or a familiar spirit. So, but again, you just get into these weird places. That's not really an NDE. It's not really a vision or a dream. It's people remembering often verifiable information about somebody else's life. You talk about that somewhat in the book. Tell us a little bit about that phenomenon, and like, how do you process? How do you deal with that? Because like I've only interviewed one guest who had a book about that, and it's something I'm going to go at length in a chapter in my next book. But it's kind of a weird fringe space of the NDE community, if you will.
Yeah, and I think it was David Bettenhouse, and I can't remember her name, but the last name was Bogman Kidd. And they're friends that basically discovered that they lived past lives together. And I think they said something like 16 or something like that. Like it was, and we've all heard of reincarnation in the past life experience. And it's basically as you describe it, it's people suddenly somehow getting memories that are verifiable that happened. Like they talk about in theirs where he was some guy and she was a singer, and they were at a wedding for a mobster and he was shot, but they can verify all this information that happened. And I even went and did my own research and was able to, like, yeah, they're not making that part up. I don't know where they got that information from, but as far as they claim, they lived this different life and they've lived many lives together. And they believe that all of us kind of have like our community that we travel through these different lives with, just in different capacities. And it's mind blowing. I think even Scott Taylor talks a bit about that in his bit, where he sort of saw all the different past lives he lived when he went over to the other side. I guess even Peter Panagore kind of substantiates that with his going through the tunnel and saying, well, you can drop into this life or this life or this life. I don't know what to make of that, man. Like I mean, I've had dreams with people that I woke up and it was real. It didn't feel like a dream. It felt like a memory. And I've even caught myself days later going, I remember when I did that with so-and-so. It's like, no, you didn't. You dreamt that. Am I touching on well, I'm dreaming. When we dream and sleep, do we travel to different lives? We pick up on things that happen. I don't know. And yeah, from the faith-based thing, that doesn't really quite work at all within the framework of what's supposed to, when I was brought up, it's like, no, when you die, you go to, my grandmother didn't even like that we cremated my dad, because she was like, he won't have a body to come back to when we all come back. Right.
There's no
so
chance,
none of that
no
fits
chance in the
with that.
resurrection with that scenario. No.
Yeah. Right. So I find it fascinating though. People believe that if you meditate the right way, you can change your vibrational frequency and drop into a past life or a different life. Like I don't know. I've tried that. It didn't work. So, um, yeah, I don't, I find it fascinating though. I find all this stuff fascinating. And like I said earlier, I think all the phenomenon, even like when you factor in religious beliefs, I think it's all kind of part of the same thing. We just, I think as individuals or groups, just get snippets of different parts of it. And then depending on what works for us, we cling to that.
Right. Well,
Um,
and I think one of the things we can do is just say, here's a weird tangent or a trail you can go off in this space. It's really intriguing. Here's how I would best, like I said earlier, is it a familiar spirit, a demon? I don't know. Yeah, like that's my first attempt at best processing it through my worldview. But I'm not fully sure what to make of it. Like I've read a couple of books in that space. I haven't done any specific interviews other than the one, and it's a weird anomaly that I don't know what to do with it because my worldview does not really allow for it. And so that's just a boundary that I'm wrestling with. And I'll do a handful of interviews and probably read 4 or 5 books from that space for my next writing project. But it's a weird one where like you, I'm like, it's super fascinating. I 100% don't know what to make of it yet. So
and there's enough people out there having these experiences and they're being documented that you can't ignore it at the same time. Like,
right.
so there's something tangible to it's like the near death experience. There's something happening to people all over the world that can't be ignored and
Yeah.
can't just be shrugged off as like just consciousness, your body's
Right.
conscious. You know what I mean? Like there's something more profound, I think, going on with all this stuff.
Well, and I think it'd be one thing if it wasn't verifiable, and I'm not saying that in every instance what people remember is verifiable, but there are documented cases where people remember things that of people who have died in great detail. They can, I like it especially when it's children who just would be. I feel like they're less prone to trying to trick you, but can identify, like show them a picture of 5 houses and they can pick the house that person lived. All the stuff like it's uncanny and it's crazy. And so, again, the only thing I can oddly liken it to, and I've done a ton of interviews in the deliverance and exorcism space. I've talked to a lot of priests through the years, and probably the closest thing is people will have these demons manifesting, often influencing a person, and the demon will start sharing all of these past life memories of, oh, I was a child who was in this house and I was killed and you need to basically right this wrong. And the people will be sent on a crazy wild goose chase for a long time. And none of it, like most of the time in that scenario, none of it plays out. None of it's verifiable. And so that's maybe the closest thing I can liken it to. But what do you do with instances where it is verifiable information? Like it's legitimately somebody's past life. I don't know. I can't reconcile my worldview with it yet. So, come back to on a future episode. Maybe we'll have it completely figured out. But it's just, again, you spend time in the NDE space. This is just one of the weird offshoots where you're like, gosh, I don't know. Because it's part of the consciousness conversation. Because how are you connecting into the consciousness of somebody else who died in the past and being able to access all these memories with specificity? It's for at the very best, I can just say it's strange at this point.
Well, and in their argument, it's the same consciousness. The consciousness just travels from body to body, right? And so eventually you kind of figure out everything you're supposed to figure out, and then you're allowed to move on to the other place, which I think that's kind of where, sort of faith-based work, maybe it works that way, right? I don't know. And a lot of, or not a lot, but there's a lot of cases with like NDEs where it's very similar to the alien abduction experience, which we could have written a whole book on that. I just didn't want to go down that rabbit hole because it is its whole other thing. But a lot of these sort of phenomenons kind of cross over with other ones, right? Which I think muddies the water and confuses things. And that's partly also what makes it so interesting.
Yeah, I worked on a book project years ago. I remember the author's first name was Tim. I can't remember his last name, but the book was called The Paranormal Conspiracy, and he attempted to look at UFOs, Bigfoot, all these different things, and basically the summary of his answers in that book is he attributed to all just demonic activity was kind of the answer that he had in that book. But people come at this stuff from a variety of different solutions to what people are experiencing. You didn't really get into this in the book, but I'm going to go here for a minute. And folks who have listened to a lot of episodes of the show, like I did interview Mark Anthony 2-ish years ago about his book, The Afterlife Frequency, and he's a practicing medium who is very popular and speaks at like IANS events and other kind of NDE conferences. But in terms of working with a medium in terms of your paranormal research, and I don't know if it relates at all into your NDE research, but just would love to hear a little bit about what that looks like.
Yeah, we don't work a lot with mediums or psychics. From my experience, there's very few that are like trustworthy. Do you know what I mean? Like you got to be careful. And when we do work with them, there's a risk factor because a lot of the times you see it a lot on the TV shows too. They bring in a psychic and the psychic comes through and tells you a whole bunch of stuff about the house. And then you go and investigate after. Well, someone's already planted a seed in your head about what could potentially be going on here. So what we do when we do use them is we will investigate and then we'll bring someone in who claims to be psychic and see if what they pick up on matches what we've been finding and the stories that we've been told through interviewing people at the home. And we've had good luck that way, where they can kind of quantify what we're experiencing. Because I do believe people, I think we all have an ability to some form of psychic ability. I'm quite empathic. I can read a room and people in the room just by feeling. And I'm usually pretty bang on, but that's as far as it goes. I think other people can touch the other side in some form, but I just think it's something you got to be careful of because there are people out there who claim to be psychic. We're just trying to take advantage of people. The big telltale for us is, do they ask you for money? Right? Like right
Sure.
out the gate.
Yeah, and I am in no way endorsing or recommending that you go work with psychics or mediums when it comes to NDEs or anything else. But again, not unlike the past lives, this is another kind of offshoot of this space that there are a lot of psychics and mediums operating in the NDE space. And I think again, when you get in, and it would vary from person to person, but more often than not, with the books I've read and the handful of people I've talked to, a lot of the mediums or psychics would say, they are helping people communicate with spirits of the dead, and they may have a worldview or theology where they don't even believe demons are real, kind of a thing. And so there's a disconnect there, depending on how you're trying to approach it. Ironically, when I talked to Mark Anthony a number of years back, it was just fascinating to get him to kind of break down what's happening in his body and sensations he experiences and just some of the different things. What was intriguing is some of those same things have a parallel in the charismatic space in terms of people operating in what we would term spiritual gifts, giving prophetic words, sensing things, having visions, and all kinds of stuff. And, again, there were some intriguing parallels, and to me, how I process that is, the world is set up to work a certain way. I would say the charismatic Christians are approaching it from kind of their worldview lens and maybe their team, if you will. The psychic or medium is approaching it from their kind of worldview lens. And, so I feel like sometimes people are operating in what I would call common grace principles of how the world's set up. They're just coming at it from very different perspectives, maybe rubbing shoulders with different spirits, if you will. Again, it's a dicey space. It's a weird space, but again, something that can't be ignored. It's one of those strange offshoots of the NDE world. And so again, something I'll address in my next book, but you can't ignore it in the sense that there is a lot of influence in this space from that world, so to speak.
Well, I like how you sort of say it. It comes down to it's almost like defining it. We all define, it's the same phenomenon. We're defining it in different ways, just based on where you're sitting, which camp you're sitting in, right? I think like we don't use the phrase demon. We'll use like negative entity, just because if you say demon, a lot of people suddenly just have this preconceived notion of what a demon is, and they think they're going to get dragged to hell and their house is going to fold up into nothing. You know what I mean? You have to be careful with the wording you use. But we've encountered stuff that I would definitely say is negative, that's probably been around forever and is not human.
Yeah, I don't see the word poltergeist used as much anymore.
No, that's changed too.
As
There are
back in the day.
poltergeists, but they don't use the terminology so much. I think after poltergeist, that changed a lot for people.
I think the place I'd love to go next is in terms of people having enhanced abilities. I think I've heard it described as, they have enhanced psychic abilities, if you will, after their near death experience. Or I have friends who, after their experience, like they're more they are more empathetic, they understand more. I have people who will say they now can operate in like gifts of prophecy and other things. So again, we're kind of changing some of the terminology depending on how the person is processing this. But it seems like for a lot of people, once they touch that other side, I always say it's almost like they always kind of have a foot in the afterlife. Like there's some part of them that is still so connected that, or even in terms of what they see, like people talk about that afterwards, they'll have visions and can see spirit angels and other things operating in their space that they never saw before their near death experience. So just maybe in terms of some of what you cover in the book, people having enhanced abilities post NDE.
Yeah, it does seem like most do, not all. There's a couple cases where that we were when we were doing the interviews where they kind of not much had changed other than they were no longer scared of death. That's kind of a common one. But yeah, even Peter said he came back and he could feel things that he couldn't really feel before, and he actually really had to work at grounding himself. Angela Artuso said the same thing after her experience. Like as a paranormal investigator, almost sort of you get a little more in tune with what's going on. It seems to be that common thing. But how could you not be changed? And if you are going to someplace, for lack of a better word, that's paranormal or supernatural, that's going to leave its mark on you. And so I think that's just a natural part of having these. I guess some would call them like a religious experience or a spiritual experience. It's going to change you in some way. I remember, some people come back and they're no longer so cared about what other people think. Most come back not caring what other people think about them. They're just going to be themselves and screw it. People have a problem with that. That's their problem. I think it sounds like it's a very, for the most part, positive, liberating experience.
Yeah, I find their lives often take some pretty dramatic turns. Like I've met people where they completely abandoned like a lucrative career. They no longer cared about money and just all these different things. I've met people where they ended up getting a divorce because they were so different than the person their spouse married. It created massive conflict, dramatic personality changes. My good friend Randy Kay, he was a corporate trainer, and before his NDE, he wasn't the most loving and empathetic guy, and so he had all of these kind of surveys and things that they would do, like to look, your personality fits here or there on this quadrant and in this quadrant kind of a thing. And he continued in corporate training for a while after his NDE, and he retook some of these tests, and how he ranked in that scale was completely opposite of how he was before his NDE. And on the other side of it, he's more loving and empathy. He's one of the kindest people I've ever met. And so I'm not saying that's scientific proof of a change, but it is interesting that, because usually those personality kind of battery test sort of things, like you sort of chart how you chart, and to have it dramatically swing the other direction after the NDE, is certainly a legitimate phenomenon. And again, I feel like that's just people process that over time. And yeah, it is interesting how much the personality changes. I do hope at some point I can do more research with people who've had like almost the PTSD or like the negative effects. Because and I wonder too, it seems like people who've had the disturbing or the hell experiences, that they don't want to talk about it as much as the people who've had like positive experiences and heaven experiences. But just I've not encountered as many people who have that sort of like their lives are altered, but almost there can be a real woundedness unless they process that PTSD and get some kind of like release or healing from it. So yeah,
I wanted to do the same almost as a follow-up, but like you say, it's finding the people who are willing to talk about it, right? It's the same with the whole alien abduction tie-in. There's so many, I think, offshoot angles you can take to this. And those ones, the alien abduction ones are I'd almost lump into like the very negative ones. People don't really have a good time with that and don't like to remember it. So I think either they're much fewer or maybe they're as frequent, but people are just like, nope, it happened. I don't even want to think about it anymore. I'm done. Like, let's move on.
I think people are hesitant because they just don't want to be painted in a negative light. And like, oh my gosh, you went to hell? What is wrong? Kind of a, yet ironic.
You do wrong in life.
Yet ironically, I've talked to experiencers who were about as Christian as a doorknob. They had no faith, agnostic, running far from God, and they would have some of them have had heaven experiences and very positive experiences. So it's not as wooden or black and white as you might think. And you'll have people who thought they were card carrying Christians who have hell experience. Like, what do you do with that? Again, your paradigms are going to be wiggled at the very least as you're wrestling with these stories.
I'm pretty sure. I mean, if you get into this work, I know like my paradigms shifted many times. And after I had my experience in 2018, by the end of that year, I had left the 9 to 5 world and went more into just doing what I wanted to do with my life. I'm like, I'm not wasting time anymore, right? So even though I didn't die, it's still, that was almost like the last straw to like, just like, nope, it's time to change, make a change. So.
And a couple of questions here yet as we begin to wrap up. In terms of like reader takeaway, like somebody spends the time, they read the book, like what's that enduring thing you hope everybody picks up? And, I would say as a guy who's widely read and written multiple books in this space, this book is a fantastic introduction. And what I loved is you introduced me to stuff that what I would consider the introductory books in my Christian publishing space. Like you just addressed some different things. And so, if you're trying to get acclimated to this space, I'd recommend this book as a good place to start. Again, just make sure, like anything, you're going to have to be comfortable with your own worldview and some of your beliefs, because this book is going to push you maybe in some other directions. If all you've read is Imagine Heaven, this is going to go into some different places. But a nice, for me, I felt it was a good introductory volume. But for you, as one of the co-authors, like you're like, man, if you read this book, this is the thing I really hope you hear, hope you take away from it.
I hope it gets people thinking and asking questions. So because it was Peter and I's introduction really to the phenomenon as well, and that's kind of how we approached it. And we just hope that when you read this book, that it just gets you thinking. If you've got one worldview, just open your mind a little bit, not to change the way you think, but just to look at other possibilities. Because I think nothing is so easy to explain that it can be one way or the other. That would be like my big hope.
And for you and Peter on the other side of the journey, like how did, and I think you partly answered this already, but like if you had to summarize it, like how did writing this book shift you, change you, challenge you?
It sort of challenged like my belief systems. I know it definitely. I'm not as scared of the whole concept of dying anymore as I was when I went into the book. I think it really had helped that way. But it also taught me kind of maximize the time I have, because none of us know what's going to happen. We could wake up in the morning and not make it to the end of the day every day. It's like that old saying. Actually, it was funny. I was watching the new John Wick movie last night, and there's a line which I love those movies. But there's a line in there that those who embrace death live, those who embrace life die. And I think that's very, very true. We're going to die. All of us will. And you better get comfortable with that and use that knowledge to kind of energize you and invigorate you and get you to live the best life you can. And I think writing the book really helped with that.
Yeah, if you read any number of stories in this space, you'll find the majority of the people who have an experience, their day started out normal. They weren't planning on dying. More often than not, they have a catastrophic accident or a health crisis or something. But it started out like any other morning. They weren't expecting any of those things to happen. Jason, in terms of people connecting with you guys, finding out more about all the work you do, where's the best place for us to go on the web?
We have a Facebook page, Canadian Paranormal Society. Come join it. It's a private group, but if you answer the questions right, we'll let you in into our little world. And it's basically a community for people to just chat about this subject matter, share funny memes, and we do update people on our investigations there. We also have a website, CanadianParanormalSociety.ca. You can also find me, Jason Hewlett, on Facebook or Instagram, Jason Hewlett Official. I like to share my stuff there. And then for the upcoming like Cursed Waters and the Pogo book, just check out smalltownmonsters.com.
And like we do with every episode, we'll make it easy. We'll link to websites in the description and the show notes for the episode. And we'll have links as well to where you can pick up your very own copy of this new book. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Jason Hewlett. Once again, our book today was Dying Light, an investigation into near-death experiences. And Jason, I want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor and a pleasure to have you on the show.
It's been an honor and a pleasure to be here.